Why, hello everyone. Today's sew along is going to be for our ladies cardigan sewing pattern. It's a sewing pattern I'm quite excited to bring to you, my very first cardigan sewing pattern, so I'm quite excited about that. Now, before we begin, I just want to mention that we are offering a brand new exclusive perk to our $10 plus patron subscribers. What I'm going to be doing is all the MP3s, all the voice recordings from all of our sew alongs. So obviously with every sew along I speak. So I'm going to just exclusively take out the voice, and those MP3s are going to be available for you to download so you can actually listen to me as you sew along. How awesome is that? So you can put me on your phone or on any device, plug in the earphones and listen as you sew along. So today we are going to be doing the cardigan, and it's really turned out to be a fairly easy sewing pattern, quite a simple one. And you would start by first obviously printing out and cutting out all of your patterns, and on our sew along videos there, in fact it's our very first sew along video that we posted. It's a very basic instructional video on how to put together your sewing patterns. It's quite quick and easy. Just pop on, have a look if you're not too sure how to put your patterns together. Otherwise, there are instructions included in the sewing pattern instructions that you will receive with your sewing patterns. Okay, so once you've done that, once you've managed to break out the sellotape and put all your sheets of paper together and cut out the size that you want, you're then going to use that to cut out your fabric and transfer any of the markings that you see. So anywhere where there's little markings and little notes on the pattern, just transfer those markings over to your fabric, preferably on the wrong side of the fabric unless it does state otherwise. Okay, so now we're ready to start. We're going to start with the bodice sections, and at right sides of the fabric facing, you're going to sew your front and back bodice sections together at the shoulder seams. Now when sewing something like shoulder seams, just a little tip to help make sure that you have better quality looking garments: always sew in the same direction. It prevents the garment from being pulled out of shape. What I mean by that is, if you're going to be sewing on one side from the sleeve up to the neckline, and then from the other side from the neckline down to the sleeve, you're sewing in one direction, you can be pulling the garment in that direction. So always try to do things in the same direction. So if you're going to be sewing from the sleeve or the armhole up to the neckline on one side, just repeat it the same on the other side. So on the other side, then you're going to sew from the sleeve or armhole and up to the neckline. It's just one of those little extra things that you can do for a much more professional looking garment. Okay, once you have done that, you are going to press open that seam, and then you can overlock or serge it if you're lucky enough to have an overlock or a serger. If not, then you could do a French seam, or if in France it's called an English seam. So French seam is very simple. You will start by having the wrong sides of the fabric facing instead of the right sides, and you will sew a seam that's only about 1/8 of an inch or 5 millimeters. So a seam that is only about 1/8 of an inch or 5 millimeters. Once you've done that, you'll press the seam, then fold the fabric over so that the right sides are then facing. Now you will re-sew the seams, but this time with a 3/8 of an inch or a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And then you would have used your full seam allowance, and you would have encased the raw edges of the fabric into a very neat looking seam. It does take a little bit of extra time, but it's well worth having a neat professional looking garment. Right, so once you've done that, once you have sewn the shoulder seams together, you're now going to be attaching the sleeves. So you'll be attaching the cap of the sleeve, that's the top curve, if you don't know what the cap of the sleeve is, to the actual armhole of the shirt. So line up the front markings and the marking on the sleeve to the shoulder seam and line up the back. Once you've done that, then stretch your, if you're using a stretch knit, you can stretch the fabric. If you're not using a stretch knit, you can use, just clip along the actual armhole of the shirt and then put it so that it fits, the sleeve cap fits neatly into that armhole, and pin it into place. Once you've done that, you then will sew your seam, the standard seam allowance. And once again, once you're finished, you will press and overlock or serge that seam to make it look much neater. Right, so now that you have attached your sleeve to your main bodice sections, you'll be able to start seeing your cardigan coming together. See, I told you it was quite an easy pattern. All you need to do now is sew close that side seam, starting at the hip of the bodice. You're going to join the front and back bodice sections together, right sides of fabric facing, and then starting at the hip of the bodice, you're going to sew all the way up to the armhole seam where you've attached the sleeve to the main bodice sections, and you're going to lift your foot on your sewing machine and pivot the fabric on the sewing needle so that you can then sew down the sleeve. So make sure you put your foot down again before you start sewing. I've done that before, forgetting it's quite a messy endeavor. So then you're going to sew down the length of your arm, closing your sleeve, keeping the right sides of the fabric facing. Then you're going to press and overlock that seam. Do the right and left sides. Then now that your main cardigan section is done, you're going to start working on the cuffs. First we're going to do the bodice cuffs. It's basically just the ribbing that goes at the bottom of the cardigan. So you'll see I'll have the back section which you cut one on the fold, and then you have the front section which you cut two fabric sections off. Now the side with the V, that is your side seam. So at that side seam you're going to match the front cuff section with the back cuff section, and you're going to make sure that the fabric is right sides facing, and then you're going to stitch that V closed using a standard seam allowance. So attach both the front section to the back section. Once you've done that, in the center of the V, so at the inner point, just with a pair of small embroidery scissors, clip into that corner. This will just help make sure that when you close the cuff and press it, that your seam actually sits a lot better and it doesn't sort of pull out of shape. So just clip in that corner, and once you've done that, press that seam open. Because you are going to be encasing the seam, you don't have to worry about serging or overlocking to make it look neater. Okay, so you've attached the front and back cuff sections together, and you clipped and pressed that seam. You're going to fold the cuff in half. You're going to fold it with wrong sides of fabric facing one another. Well, once you've done, just make sure you line up the seam so that everything sits neatly together. Then along the top raw edge of that cuff, just baste it closed about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch near the end. you can use, to save time, a very large machine stitch. So a 4 or a 5, your largest stitching function on the machine, is a basting function. So just baste the top of that cuff closed. Then once you've done that, press that cuff flat beneath this. For something like that where there's a bit of bulk, I usually like to use a bit of starch in my spray, the water that I spray onto garments for pressing. Now we are going to attach it to the main bodice sections. So with the center front lined up and the side seams lined up and the center back lined up, right sides facing, you're going to attach the cuff along the bottom of the bodice. Now the cuff, it will be just slightly, not a lot, but just slightly smaller than the bodice. So all you need to do is pull the cuff to fit the length of the main bodice, pull it and pin it in place so that when it goes back it sits neatly and evenly. And so once you manage to pin it all together, pinning for something like this is actually quite important. It's not necessarily something you can just wing, because just winging it can cause issues. So make sure you pin the cuff to the bodice first, then stitch it. Now because you're going to be going, especially now because you're going to be going along the max stretch length of the fabric, make sure you're using a stretch stitch function on your sewing machine. Now some machines only have 1 or 2 stretch stitch functions, some have a number of them. What I suggest you do is you first practice on a piece of fabric to see which one you like the most. If you're not too sure what it looks like, get your machine manual out and have a look. It'll show you what the different symbols mean. But usually a standard straight stitch for a stretch fabric, so a standard stretch straight stitch that's I can't say that 10 times very fast. So your standard stretch straight stitch is usually marked by 3 lines on your sewing machine. So you'll see a little marking and it'll have 3 lines underneath it. And you're going to turn your dial to that function. That is your standard straight stretch stitch. Yeah. So always make sure when you're working with knit fabrics that you do use your stretch stitches, because there's nothing worse than putting so much work into using a knit fabric and creating a beautiful garment, only to put it on and you had that fantastic cracking of all your stitching coming undone because you use this normal standard stitch. So yes, it does take long. Stretch stitches do take a lot more time, but it is really worth it for a good quality garment that's not going to fall apart the first time you put it together. Okay, so now that you have completed the cuffs and you've attached the cuffs to your garment, then just serge or overlock that seam to make sure that it looks quite nice and neat. Then you're going to be doing the cuffs for your cardigan, for the arms, your cuffs for your sleeves. So you see the cuffs are rectangular shape. So along the fullest length, you're going to fold the cuff in half, not the fold line. I know there is a fold line marking on the pattern, but that's not the fold line we're going to be using now. You're going to be folding it in the opposite direction. So you're going to fold that cuff with the right sides of the fabric facing. Then fold the cuff with the right sides of the fabric facing. And you're going to sew that open seam closed, keeping a standard seam allowance. Then what you're going to do is now you're going to fold the cuff along that fold line. Fold your cuff, right side fabric out, wrong sides of fabric together, enclosing the seam you just made. Okay, and now along that top raw edge, you're going to be basting the cuff closed. Now you have a finished cuff, so all you need to do is attach it to your sleeve. But press it first so that it's nice and neat. And when you baste, you'll only be basting about 5 millimeters on 1/8 of an inch near the edge. Okay, so now you're going to take your cuff and you're going to insert it into your sleeve. So your sleeve is going to be wrong side out, and you're going to take the cuff, insert it into the sleeve so the cuff is against the right side of the fabric. You're going to line up the seam of the cuff with the seam of the sleeve and pin that in place so that it doesn't move, and make sure the raw edges of the sleeve and the raw edges of the cuff are matched up. Then the same with the bodice. The cuff of the sleeve is quite a bit shorter than the sleeve hole itself, so you're going to stretch that cuff and make it fit into the sleeve, and you're going to pin it into place. Once you've put it into place, have a look at it and make sure that it sort of gathers as evenly as possible around the edge before you stitch it. So just do a double check. With a lot of your work, just doing a bit of a double check really saves you a lot of hassles in the future. Pinning and double checking, two fabulous tools you can use. So once you're sure that your cuff is going to gather evenly, you can then stitch the cuff and the sleeve together using a standard seam allowance. And once that's done, you can overlock or serge that seam for neatness. Okay, we're almost there. You'll see your cardigan is starting to look very much so like a cardigan. Right, now we're going to be attaching the facing sections. As you can see, there are two sections. It's the back neckline facing, and then there's the front facing. So you'll have basically two sets. So you'll have 2 of the back necklines cut on the fold and 4 of the front facings cut out of the fabric. So right sides of fabric facing, sew the back facing sections to the front facing sections, and you should have, once that's done, you should have 2 of these sections. You're then going to press that seam. You don't have to overlock or serge it, as it won't be visible. Then with right sides of the fabric facing, so with right sides of the fabric facing, you're going to join the 2 facing sections together. You're going to make sure you line them up nicely, so make sure they lie neatly on top of each other and that the hem and the seam lines are matched up perfectly. Then to sew them together, you go to sew firstly along the bottom hemline, then you go to sew up around the inner curve, and when you get to the other side, you're going to pivot the needle on the sewing machine and sew the other bottom hemline. Okay, then once you've done that, clip away the bulk fabric in the corners at the bottom hemlines, and at the small curve at the base of the back of the neckline, you want to clip away there in order to allow it to sit neatly. Then turn your fabric right side out so that you're hiding that seam you just made, and with the wrong sides of the fabric facing, make sure you push out your corners and it sits neatly. Press your facing, and once it's pressed and you're sure that it looks neat, then you're going to baste close the raw edges of the outer seam of the facing. You're going to baste about 5 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch near the edge. Right, then you're going to take this facing, and with that raw basted edge, you're going to line that up with the neckline of your cardigan and the front bodice of your cardigan. So starting at the one hemline with the facing against the right side of the cardigan fabric, just line it up and pin it nicely. Make sure the shoulder seams are nice and lined up. Now with the curve of the neckline itself, in order to get the back neckline to sit neatly with the outer curve of the facing, with the small embroidery scissors, clip along that neckline in order to help it sit neatly with the facing. Okay, make sure everything is pinned together before you stitch, just to assist you so you can double check your work and be sure that everything is going to sit right before you actually stitch it finished. So if you're happy with the way the facing is sitting on the cardigan and the fabric isn't being pulled in any way, then attach the facing by stitching a standard 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then to finish that seam, press it open and overlock or serge the raw edge for neatness. Right, then we only have one step left to go, and that is attaching your buttons. Line up your buttons in the front facing sections just to give you an idea to see where you want your buttonholes to be, and see where you want your buttons to start or where you want your buttons to finish. You can use 4 or 5 buttons for this, and make sure that they are equal spaces apart. So once you've lined up your buttons and you're happy with where they're going to be on the cardigan, just take your ruler and a marking pencil or some marking chalk and just measure and mark your buttons so that they are equal distance apart. Then on the front right cardigan, match up those markings with your buttons, and this is where you're going to be stitching your buttonholes. On the front left of the cardigan is where you're going to be sewing your buttons at those marked out spaces. So all you need to do now is make those buttonholes and attach your buttons, and your cardigan is finished. Feel free to share your finished cardigans with us on Instagram at @boolaheart or on Twitter at @mysewingpattern. Enjoy and happy sewing!